Chapter 24 of Sylvie and Bruno by Lewis Carroll. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Frog's Birthday Treat. And so it came to pass that, just a week after the day when my fairy friends first appeared as children, I found myself taking a farewell stroll through the wood, in the hope of meeting them once more. I had but to stretch myself on the smooth turf, and the eerie feeling was on me in a moment.
"Put your ear welly low down," said Bruno, "and I'll tell you a secret. It's the frog's birthday treat, and we've lost the baby."
"What baby?" I said, quite bewildered by this complicated piece of news.
"The Queen's baby, of course," said Bruno. "Titania's baby, and we's welly sorry. Sylvie, she's oh so sorry."
"How sorry is she?" I asked mischievously.
3/4 of a yard,"
Bruno replied with perfect solemnity.
"And I'm a little sorry too,"
he added, shutting his eyes so as not to see that he was smiling. "And what are you doing about the baby?"
"Well, the soldiers are looking for it up and down everywhere."
"The soldiers?" I exclaimed.
"Yes, of course,"
said Bruno.
"When there's no fighting to be done, the soldiers does any little odd jobs, you know."
I was amused at the idea of its being a little odd job to find the royal baby. "But how did you come to lose it?" I asked.
"We put it in a flower,"
Sylvie, who had just joined us, explained, with her eyes full of tears.
"Only we can't remember which." "She says us put it in a flower,"
Bruno interrupted.
"'cause she doesn't want I to get punished, but it were really me what put it there. Sylvie were picking dindledums." "You shouldn't say us put it in a flower,"
Sylvie very gravely remarked.
"Well, hush then,"
said Bruno.
"I never can remember those horrid H's."
"Let me help you to look for it," I said. So Sylvie and I made a voyage of discovery among all the flowers, but there was no baby to be seen. "What's become of Bruno?" I said, when we had completed our tour.
"He's down in the ditch there," said Sylvie, "amusing a young frog."
I went down on my hands and knees to look for him, for I felt very curious to know how young frogs ought to be amused. After a minute's search, I found him sitting at the edge of the ditch by the side of the little frog, and looking rather disconsolate. "How are you getting on, Bruno?" I said, nodding to him as he looked up.
"Can't amuse it no more,"
Bruno answered very dolefully.
"'cause it won't say what it would like to do next. I've showed it all the duckweeds and a live caddisworm, but it won't say nothing. What would oo like?"
he shouted into the ear of the frog. But the little creature sat quite still and took no notice of him.
"It's deaf, I think,"
Bruno said, turning away with a sigh.
"And it's time to get the theatre ready."
"Who are the audience to be?"
"Only but frogs,"
said Bruno.
"but they haven't come yet. They wants to be drove up like sheep."
"Would it save time," I suggested, "if I were to walk around with Sylvie to drive up the frogs while you get the theatre ready?"
"That are a good plan,"
cried Bruno.
"But where are Sylvie?"
"I'm here," said Sylvie, peeping over the edge of the bank.
"I was just watching 2 frogs that were having a race." "Which won it?"
Bruno eagerly inquired. Sylvie was puzzled.
"He does ask such hard questions,"
she confided to me. "And what's to happen in the theatre?" I asked.
"First they have their birthday feast,"
Sylvie said.
"Then Bruno does some bits of Shakespeare. Then he tells them a story."
I should think the frogs like the feast best, don't they?
Well, there's generally very few of them that get any. They will keep their mouths shut so tight, and it's just as well they do," she added, "because Bruno likes to cook it himself, and he cooks very queerly. Now they're all in. Would you just help me to put them with their heads the right way?"
We soon managed this part of the business, though the frogs kept up a most discontented croaking all the time. "What are they saying?" I asked Sylvie.
"They're saying fork, fork. It's very silly of them. You're not going to have forks,"
she announced with some severity.
"Those that want any feast have just got to open their mouths, and Bruno will put some of it in."
At this moment Bruno appeared, wearing a little white apron to show that he was a cook, and carrying a tureen full of a very queer-looking soup. I watched very carefully as he moved about among the frogs, but I could not see that any of them opened their mouths to be fed, except one very young one, and I'm nearly sure it did it accidentally in yawning. However, Bruno instantly put a large spoonful of soup into its mouth, and the poor little thing coughed violently for some time. So Sylvie and I had to share the soup between us, and pretend to enjoy it, for it certainly was very queerly cooked. I only ventured to take one spoonful of it. Sylvie's summer soup, Bruno said it was, and most candidly confessed that it was not at all nice, and I could not feel surprised that so many of the guests had kept their mouths shut up tight.
"What's the soup made of, Bruno?"
said Sylvie, who had put a spoonful of it to her lips and was making a wry face over it. And Bruno's answer was anything but encouraging.
"Bits of things."
The entertainment was to conclude with bits of Shakespeare, as Sylvie expressed it, which were all to be done by Bruno, Sylvie being fully engaged in making the frogs keep their heads towards the stage, after which Bruno was to appear in his real character and tell them a story of his own invention. "Will the story have a moral to it?" I asked Sylvie, while Bruno was away behind the hedge dressing for the first bit.
"I think so,"
Sylvie replied doubtfully.
"There generally is a moral, only he puts it in too soon."
"And will he say all the bits of Shakespeare?"
"No, he'll only act them," said Sylvie. "He knows hardly any of the words. When I see what he's dressed like, I have to tell the frogs what character it is. They're always in such a hurry to guess. Don't you hear them all saying, 'What? What?'"
And so indeed they were. It had only sounded like croaking till Sylvie explained it, but I could now make out the "What? What?" quite distinctly. But why do they try to guess it before they see it?
"I don't know," Sylvie said, "but they always do. Sometimes they begin guessing weeks and weeks before the day."
So now, when you hear the frogs croaking in a particularly melancholy way, you may be sure they're trying to guess Bruno's next Shakespeare bit. Isn't that interesting? However, the chorus of guessing was cut short by Bruno, who suddenly rushed on from behind the scenes and took a flying leap down among the frogs to rearrange them. For the oldest and fattest frog, who had never been properly arranged so that he could see the stage, and so had no idea what was going on, was getting restless, and had upset several of the frogs and turned others round with their heads the wrong way. And it was no good at all, Bruno said, to do a bit of Shakespeare when there was nobody to look at it. You see, he didn't count me as anybody. So he set to work with a stick, stirring them up, very much as you would stir up tea in a cup, till most of them had at least one great stupid eye gazing at the stage.
"Who must come and sit among them, Sylvie?"
he said in despair.
"I've put these two side by side with their noses the same way ever so many times, but they do squirrel so."
So Sylvie took her place as mistress of the ceremonies, and Bruno vanished again behind the scenes to dress for the first bit. "Hamlet!" was suddenly proclaimed in the clear, sweet tones I knew so well. The croaking all ceased in a moment, and I turned to the stage in some curiosity to see what Bruno's ideas were as to the behaviour of Shakespeare's greatest character. According to this eminent interpreter of the drama, Hamlet wore a short black cloak, which he chiefly used for muffling up his face, as if he suffered a good deal from toothache, and turned out his toes very much as he walked.
"To be or not to be?"
Hamlet remarked in a cheerful tone, and then turned head over heels several times, his cloak dropping off in the performance. I felt a little disappointed. Bruno's conception of the part seemed so wanting in dignity. "Won't he say any more of the speech?" I whispered to Sylvie.
"I think not,"
Sylvie whispered in reply.
"He generally turns head over heels when he doesn't know any more words."
Bruno had meanwhile settled the question by disappearing from the stage, and the frogs instantly began inquiring the name of the next character.
"You'll know directly,"
cried Sylvie, as she adjusted 2 or 3 young frogs that had struggled round with their backs to the stage.
"Macbeth,"
she added as Bruno reappeared. Macbeth had something twisted round him that went over one shoulder and under the other arm, and was meant, I believe, for a Scotch plaid. He had a thorn in his hand, which he held out at arm's length, as if he were a little afraid of it.
"Is this a dagger?"
Macbeth inquired, in a puzzled sort of tone, and instantly a chorus of "Don, Don" arose from the frogs. I had quite learned to understand their croaking by this time.
"It's a dagger,"
Sylvie proclaimed in a peremptory tone.
"Hold your tongues,"
and the croaking ceased at once. Shakespeare has not told us, so far as I know, that Macbeth had any such eccentric habit as turning head over heels in private life, but Bruno evidently considered it quite an essential part of the character, and left the stage in a series of somersaults. However, he was back again in a few moments, having tucked under his chin the end of a tuft of wool, probably left on the thorn by a wandering sheep, which made a magnificent beard that reached nearly down to his feet.
"Shylock!"
Sylvie proclaimed.
"No, I beg your pardon."
She hastily corrected herself.
"King Lear, I hadn't noticed the crown."
Bruno had very cleverly provided one which fitted him exactly by cutting out the centre of a dandelion to make room for his head. King Lear folded his arms to the imminent peril of his beard and said in a mild explanatory tone,
"I every inch a king,"
and then paused, as if to consider how this could best be proved, and here, with all possible deference to Bruno as a Shakespearean critic, I must express my opinion that the poet did not mean his 3 great tragic heroes to be so strangely alike in their personal habits, nor do I believe that he would have accepted the faculty of turning head over heels as any proof at all of royal descent. Yet it appeared that King Lear, after deep meditation, could think of no other argument by which to prove his kingship, and as this was the last of the bits of Shakespeare—
"We never do more than 3,
Sylvie explained in a whisper. Bruno gave the audience quite a long series of somersaults before he finally retired, leaving the enraptured frogs all crying out "Mop, mop," which I suppose was their way of encoring a performance. But Bruno wouldn't appear again till the proper time came for telling the story. When he appeared at last in his real character, I noticed a remarkable change in his behaviour. He tried no more somersaults. It was clear his opinion that, however suitable the habit of turning head over heels might be to such petty individuals as Hamlet and King Lear, it would never do for Bruno to sacrifice his dignity to such an extent. But it was equally clear that he did not feel entirely at his ease, standing all alone on the stage with no costume to disguise him. And though he began several times,
"There was a mouse,"
he kept glancing up and down and on all sides, as if in search of more comfortable quarters from which to tell the story. Standing on one side of the stage and partly overshadowing it was a tall foxglove, which seemed, as the evening breeze gently swayed it hither and thither, to offer exactly the sort of accommodation that the orator desired. Having once decided on his quarters, it needed only a second or two for him to run up the stem like a tiny squirrel, and to seat himself astride on the topmost bend where the fairy bells cluster most closely, and from whence he could look down on his audience from such a height that all shyness vanished, and he began his story merrily.
"Once there was a mouse and a crocodile, and a man and a goat and a lion."
I had never heard the dramatis personae tumbled into a story with such profusion and in such reckless haste, and it fairly took my breath away. Even Sylvie gave a little gasp, and allowed 3 of the frogs, who seemed to be getting tired of the entertainment, to hop away into the ditch without attempting to stop them.
"And the mouse found a shoe, and it thought it were a mousetrap, so it got right in, and it stayed in ever so long."
"Why did it stay in?" said Sylvie. Her function seemed to be much the same as that of the chorus in a Greek play. She had to encourage the orator and draw him out by a series of intelligent questions.
"'Cause it thought it couldn't get out again,"
Bruno explained.
"It were a clever mouse. It knew it couldn't get out of traps."
"But why did it go in at all?" said Sylvie.
"And it jump, and it jump,"
Bruno proceeded, ignoring this question.
"And at last it got right out again, and it looked at the mark in the shoe, and the man's name were in it, so it knew it wasn't its own shoe."
"Had it thought it was?" said Sylvie.
"Why, didn't I tell you? It thought it were a mouse-trap,"
the indignant orator replied.
"Please, Mr. Sir, will you make Sylvie attend?"
Sylvie was silenced, and was all attention. In fact, she and I were most of the audience now, as the frogs kept hopping away, and there were very few of them left.
"So the mouse gave the man his shoe, and the man were welly glad, 'cause he hadn't got but one shoe, and he were hopping to get the other."
Here I ventured on a question. "Do you mean hopping or hoping?"
"Both,"
said Bruno.
"And the man took the goat out of the sack."
"We haven't heard of the sack before," I said.
"Nor you won't hear of it again,"
said Bruno.
"And he said to the goat, 'Who will walk about here till I comes back?' And he went, and he tumbled into a deep hole, and the goat walked round and round, and it walked under the tree, and it wug its tail, and it looked up in the tree, and it sang a sad little song. Who never heard such a sad little song?"
"Can you sing it, Bruno?" I asked.
"Yes, I can,"
Bruno replied readily.
"And I shan't. It would make Sylvie cry."
"It wouldn't," Sylvie interrupted in great indignation. "And I don't believe the goat sang it at all."
"It did, though,"
said Bruno.
"It singed it right through. I sawed it singing with its long beard."
"It couldn't sing with its beard," I said, hoping to puzzle the little fellow. "A beard isn't a voice."
"Well then, who couldn't walk with Sylvie?"
Bruno cried triumphantly.
"Sylvie isn't a foot."
I thought I had better follow Sylvie's example and be silent for a while. Bruno was too sharp for us.
"And when it had singed all the song, it ran away, for to get along to look for the man who know, and the crocodile got along after it, for to bite it, and the mouse got along after the crocodile."
"Wasn't the crocodile running?" Sylvie inquired. She appealed to me.
"Crocodiles do run, don't they?"
I suggested crawling as the proper word.
"He wasn't running,"
said Bruno.
"and he wasn't crawling. He went struggling along like a portmanteau, and he held his chin ever so high in the air."
"What did he do that for?" said Sylvie.
"'Cause he hadn't got a toothache,"
said Bruno.
"Can't you make out nothing without I explain it? Why, if he'd had a toothache, of course he'd have held his head down like this, and he'd have put a lot of warm blankets round it."
"If he had any blankets," Sylvie argued.
"'Course he had blankets,"
retorted her brother.
"Doos oo think crocodiles go walks without blankets?" And he frowned with his eyebrows, and the goat was welly frightened at his eyebrows.
"I'd never be afraid of eyebrows," exclaimed Sylvie.
"I should think oo would, though, if they got a crocodile fastened to them, like these had, and so the man jamp, and he jamp, and at last he got right out of the hole."
Sylvie gave another little gasp. This rapid dodging about among the characters of the story had taken away her breath.
"And he runned away for to look for the goat, and he heard the lion grunting."
"Lions don't grunt," said Sylvie.
"This one did,"
said Bruno.
"And its mouth were like a large cupboard, and it had plenty of room in its mouth, and the lion runned after the man for to eat him, and the mouse runned after the lion."
"But the mouse was running after the crocodile," I said. "He couldn't run after both." Bruno sighed over the density of his audience, but explained very patiently.
"He did run after both, 'cause they went the same way, and first he caught the crocodile, and then he didn't catch the lion, and when he caught the crocodile, what does oo think he did? 'Course he got pincers in his pocket."
"I can't guess," said Sylvie.
"Nobody couldn't guess it,"
Bruno cried in high glee.
"Why, he wrenched out the crocodile's tooth."
"Which tooth?" I ventured to ask. But Bruno was not to be puzzled.
"The tooth he were going to bite the goat with, of course."
"He couldn't be sure about that," I argued, "unless he wrenched out all its teeth." Bruno laughed merrily and half sang as he swung himself backwards and forwards.
"He did wrench out all its teeth."
"Why did the crocodile wait to have them wrenched out?" said Sylvie.
"It had to wait,"
said Bruno. I ventured on another question. "But what became of the man who said, 'You may wait here till I come back'?"
"He didn't say oo may,"
Bruno explained.
"He said oo will, just like Sylvie says to me oo will do oor lessons till 12 o'clock. Oh, I wish," he added with a little sigh, "I wish Sylvie would say oo may do oor lessons."
This was a dangerous subject for discussion, Sylvie seemed to think. She returned to the story.
"But what became of the man?" "Well, the lion springed at him, but it came so slow it were 3 weeks in the air."
"Did the man wait for it all that time?" I said.
"Course he didn't,"
Bruno replied, gliding head first down the stem of the foxglove. For the story was evidently close to its end.
"He sold his house, and he packed up his things while the lion were coming, and he went and he lived in another town, so the lion ate the wrong man."
This was evidently the moral, so Sylvie made her final proclamation to the frogs.
"The story's finished, and whatever is to be learnt from it," she added aside to me, "I'm sure I don't know."
I did not feel quite clear about it myself, so made no suggestion. But the frogs seemed quite content, moral or no moral, and merely raised a husky chorus of "Off, off," as they hopped away. End of chapter 24. Chapter 25 of Sylvie and Bruno by Lewis Carroll. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Looking eastward. "It's just a week," I said 3 days later to Arthur, "since we heard of Lady Muriel's engagement. I think I ought to call at any rate and offer my congratulations. Won't you come with me?" A pained expression passed over his face. "When must you leave us?" he asked. "By the first train on Monday." "Well, yes, I will come with you. It would seem strange and unfriendly if I didn't. But this is only Friday. Give me till Sunday afternoon. I shall be stronger then." Shading his eyes with one hand, as if half ashamed of the tears that were coursing down his cheeks, he held the other out to me. It trembled as I clasped it. I tried to frame some words of sympathy, but they seemed poor and cold, and I left them unspoken. "Good night," was all I said. "Good night, dear friend," he replied. There was a manly vigour in his tone that convinced me he was wrestling with and triumphing over the great sorrow that had so nearly wrecked his life, and that on the stepping stone of his dead self he would surely rise to higher things. There was no chance, I was glad to think, as we set out on Sunday afternoon, of meeting Eric at the Hall, as he had returned to town the day after his engagement was announced. His presence might have disturbed the calm, the almost unnatural calm, with which Arthur met the woman who had won his heart, and murmured the few graceful words of sympathy that the occasion demanded. Lady Muriel was perfectly radiant with happiness. Sadness could not live in the light of such a smile, and even Arthur brightened under it, and when she remarked,
"You see, I'm watering my flowers, though it is the Sabbath day,"
his voice had almost its old ring of cheerfulness as he replied,
"Even on the Sabbath works of mercy are allowed. But this isn't the Sabbath day. The Sabbath day has ceased to exist."
"I know it's not Saturday," Lady Muriel replied, "but isn't Sunday often called the Christian Sabbath?"
"It is so called, I think, in recognition of the spirit of the Jewish institution, that one day in 7 should be a day of rest. But I hold that Christians are freed from the literal observance of the 4th commandment."
"Then where is our authority for Sunday observance?"
"We have first the fact that the 7th day was sanctified when God rested from the work of creation. That is binding on us as theists. Secondly, we have the fact that the Lord's Day is a Christian institution. That is binding on us as Christians."
"And your practical rules would be?"
"First, as theists, to keep it holy in some special way, and to make it, so far as is reasonably possible, a day of rest. Secondly, as Christians, to attend public worship."
"And what of amusements?"
"I would say of them, as of all kinds of work, whatever is innocent on a weekday is innocent on Sunday, provided it does not interfere with the duties of the day."
"Then you would allow children to play on Sunday?"
"Certainly I would. Why make the day irksome to their restless natures?"
"I have a letter somewhere," said Lady Muriel, "from an old friend, describing the way in which Sunday was kept in her younger days. I will fetch it for you."
"I had a similar description, viva voce, years ago," Arthur said when she had left us. "From a little girl. It was really touching to hear the melancholy tone in which she said, 'On Sunday I mustn't play with my doll. On Sunday I mustn't run on the sands. On Sunday I mustn't dig in the garden.' Poor child! She had indeed abundant cause for hating Sunday."
"Here is the letter," said Lady Muriel, returning. "Let me read you a piece of it. When as a child I first opened my eyes on a Sunday morning, a feeling of dismal anticipation, which began at least on the Friday, culminated. I knew what was before me, and my wish, if not my word, was
Would God it were evening. It was no day of rest, but a day of texts, of catechisms, Watts, of tracts about converted swearers, godly charwomen, and edifying deaths of sinners saved. Up with the lark, hymns and portions of Scripture had to be learnt by heart till 8 o'clock, when there were family prayers, then breakfast, which I was never able to enjoy, partly from the fast already undergone, and partly from the outlook I dreaded. At 9 came Sunday school, and it made me indignant to be put into the class with the village children, as well as alarmed lest, by some mistake of mine, I should be put below them. The church service was a veritable wilderness of sin. I wandered in it, pitching the tabernacle of my thoughts on the lining of the square family pew. The fidgets of my smaller brothers, and the horror of knowing that on the Monday I should have to write out from memory jottings of the rambling, disconnected, extempore sermon, which might have had any text but its own, and to stand or fall by the results. This was followed by a cold dinner at 1. Servants too have no work. Sunday school again from 2 to 4, an evening service at 6. The intervals were perhaps the greatest trial of all. From the efforts I had to make to be less than usually sinful by reading books and sermons as barren as the Dead Sea. There was but one rosy spot in the distance all that day, and that was bedtime, which never could come too early.
"Such teaching was well meant, no doubt," said Arthur, "but it must have driven many of its victims into deserting the church services altogether."
"I'm afraid I was a deserter this morning," she gravely said. "I had to write to Eric. Would you mind me telling you something he said about prayer? It had never struck me in that light before."
"In what light?" said Arthur.
"Why, that all nature goes by fixed, regular laws. Science has proved that, so that asking God to do anything, except of course praying for spiritual blessings, is to expect a miracle. And we've no right to do that. I've not put it as well as he did, but that was the outcome of it, and it has confused me. Please tell me what you can say in answer to it."
"I don't propose to discuss Captain Linden's difficulties," Arthur gravely replied, "especially as he is not present. But if it is your difficulty," his voice unconsciously took a tenderer tone, "then I will speak."
"It is my difficulty," she said anxiously.
"Then I will begin by asking, why did you accept spiritual blessings? Is not your mind a part of nature?"
"Yes, but free will comes in there. I can choose this or that, and God can influence my choice."
"Then you are not a fatalist?"
"Oh, no,"
she earnestly exclaimed. "Thank God," Arthur said to himself, but in so low a whisper that only I heard it. "You grant, then, that I can, by an act of free choice, move this cup," suiting the action to the word, "this way or that way?"
"Yes, I grant it."
"Well, let us see how far the result is produced by fixed laws. The cup moves because certain mechanical forces are impressed on it by my hand. My hand moves because certain forces, electric, magnetic, or whatever nerve force may prove to be, are impressed on it by my brain. This nerve force, stored in the brain, would probably be traceable, if science were complete, to chemical forces supplied to the brain by the blood, and ultimately derived from the food I eat and the air I breathe."
"But would not that be fatalism? Where would free will come in?"
"In choice of nerves," replied Arthur. "The nerve force in the brain may flow just as naturally down one nerve as down another. We need something more than a fixed law of nature to settle which nerve shall carry it. That something is free will." Her eyes sparkled, I see what you mean," she exclaimed. "Human free will is an exception to the system of fixed law." And then I think he pointed out that God can only influence nature by influencing human wills, so that we might reasonably pray, "Give us this day our daily bread," because many of the causes that produce bread are under man's control. But to pray for rain or fine weather would be as unreasonable as— She checked herself, as if fearful of saying something irreverent. In a hushed, low tone that trembled with emotion and with the solemnity of one in the presence of death, Arthur slowly replied, "Shall he that contendeth with the Almighty instruct him? Shall we, the swarm that in the noontide beam were born, feeling in ourselves the power to direct, this way or that, the forces of nature, of which we form so trivial a part, shall we, in our boundless arrogance, in our pitiful conceit, deny the power to the Ancient of Days, saying to our Creator, thus far and no further, Thou madest, but thou canst not rule?" Lady Muriel had covered her face in her hands, and did not look up. She only murmured, "Thanks, thanks," again and again. We rose to go. Arthur said with evident effort, "One word more. If you would know the power of prayer, in anything and everything that man can need, try it. Ask, and it shall be given you. I have tried it. I know that God answers prayer." Our walk home was a silent one, till we had nearly reached the lodgings. Then Arthur murmured, and it was almost an echo of my own thoughts, "What knowest thou, O wife, whether thou shalt save thy husband?" The subject was not touched on again. We sat on, talking, while hour after hour of this our last night together glided away unnoticed. He had much to tell me about India and the new life he was going to, and the work he hoped to do. And his great generous soul seemed so filled with noble ambition as to have no space left for any vain regret or selfish repining. "Come, it's nearly morning," Arthur said at last, rising and leading the way upstairs. "The sun will be rising in a few minutes, and though I have basely defrauded you of your last chance of a night's rest, I'm sure you'll forgive me, for I really couldn't bring myself to say good night sooner. And God knows whether you'll ever see me again or hear from me." "Hear of you I'm certain I shall," I warmly responded, and quoted the concluding lines of that strange poem, Wearing. "Oh, never star was lost here, but it rose afar. Look east where whole new thousands are, in Vishnu land, what avatar?" "Aye, look eastward," Arthur eagerly replied, pausing at the staircase window, which commanded a fine view of the sea and the eastward horizon. "The west is the fitting tomb for all the sorrow and the sighting, all the errors and the follies of the past, for all its withered hopes and all its buried loves. From the east comes new strength, new ambition, new hope, new life, new love. Look eastward, aye, look eastward." His last words were still ringing in my ears as I entered my room and undrew the window curtains, just in time to see the sun burst in glory from his ocean prison and clothe the world in the light of a new day. So may it be for him and me and all of us, I mused. All that is evil and dead and hopeless fading with the night that is past. All that is good and living and hopeful rising with the dawn of day. Fading with the night, the chilly mists and the noxious vapours and the heavy shadows and the wailing gusts and the owl's melancholy hootings, rising with the day, the darting shafts of light, and the wholesome morning breeze, and the warmth of a dawning life, and the mad music of the lark. Look eastward. Fading with the night the clouds of ignorance, and the deadly blight of sin, and the silent tears of sorrow, and ever rising higher, higher with the day, the radiant dawn of knowledge, and the sweet breath of purity, and the throb of a world's ecstasy. Look eastward. Fading with the night, the memory of a dead love, and the withering leaves of a blighted hope, and the sickly repinings and moody regrets that numb the best energies of the soul, and rising, broadening, rolling upward like a living flood, the manly resolve and the dauntless will, and the heavenward gaze of faith, the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. Look eastward. Aye, look eastward. End of chapter 25. End of Sylvie and Bruno by Lewis Carroll.